Child of the Broken Bond. Written by Short Story Queen. Chapter 1. Whispers beneath his skin. The sound of shattering glass didn't come from the kitchen. It came from Lior's mouth. Raisa had only just turned from the sink, her hand half submerged in lukewarm dishwater, when the shriek hit the walls. A sound too raw for a child, too primal, a sound that cracked the air as though it didn't belong in this world. Her body moved before her thoughts caught up. Her hands were still dripping, feet still bare, but she was already sprinting down the narrow hallway of the townhouse, heart knocking against her ribs in silent, hollow rhythm. She knew. The silence that followed told her everything. Lior hadn't screamed because he was scared. He'd screamed because something inside him had clawed its way out. She burst into the small bedroom just as the air twisted into pressure, heat folding in around her, sharp and suffocating. Her son was curled at the foot of his bed, spine arched unnaturally, breath coming in ragged gasps, his tiny fingers curled in clawed angles against the sheets. The shadows cast by the nightlight flickered strangely on his skin, illuminating the fine silver sheen that coated his arms. His bones convulsed again, and for a moment he looked at her with eyes that weren't his own. Silver. No, not just silver. Reflective, ancient, wrong on a child. He convulsed and then he shifted, not into fur or fang, not into the soft, trembling first shift of a normal young wolf. No. His body pulsed outward, forced by a power he didn't understand. The mattress split beneath him, the walls groaned, and when he collapsed again, limp and steaming with sweat, something in the air whispered, not in words, an instinct. It slid under her skin like a splinter. She staggered back, hand over her mouth, not because of what she saw, but because she could feel her wolf. Thorn, dormant all these years, pressed like a breath against the inside of her ribs, not speaking, not howling, just there. The silence didn't last. It shattered again with the knock. Firm, deliberate, the kind that didn't ask permission. 3 slow thuds, measured, like the person on the other side already owned the house and had simply returned to claim it. No one knew where she lived, and no one who should have found her. Not unless... She scooped Lior up. He was breathing now, trembling but conscious, and backed into the hallway. Her mind scrambled through exit routes. She'd packed go bags in every closet. There were burner phones hidden in the walls, cash stashed in the vents. But none of that would matter if they had found her. The knock came again. 3 beats. Then the door creaked open without being touched. She'd locked it. She knew she had. The bolt had clicked before she'd even finished dishes. But it swung open, heavy and sure, and the scent that poured through nearly brought her to her knees. Smoke, pine, earth soaked in old blood, and beneath it, something hotter, something that burned like a memory long buried. Kael. She didn't see him right away, not fully. Just the outline in the light. Tall and unbending. Broad shoulders wrapped in a dark coat, head tilted slightly as if he were listening to something she couldn't hear. For one breath, he didn't step inside. And then he did, and he moved like the house belonged to him, like she did. Like the 6 years between them hadn't mattered at all. He stopped just inside the doorway, eyes flicking to the hallway, nostrils flaring. When he spoke, the voice was low, measured. I smelled him shift. Her throat closed. She didn't answer. Couldn't. Not when the sound of his voice sent heat spiraling down her spine and dread curdling her stomach. She hadn't seen him since the day she fled, since she ran from the altar, from the wreckage of what they'd been building, from the cruel image of him with her sister's scent all over his skin. But now, standing there in her doorway, Kael didn't look like a man who'd betrayed her. He looked like a man who'd bled for the silence that followed. She didn't speak until he stepped closer. Her body flinched before her voice could steady. You're not supposed to be here. Kael didn't flinch. His eyes, still the color of deep ice in winter, moved past her to the boy in her arms. He didn't ask if Lior was his. He didn't demand answers or rage at the years lost. He just stared, and she hated him for that. Hated how still he was, how he didn't reach for the boy, didn't plead, just watched with something unreadable behind his gaze. Not coldness. Pain. "This wasn't how I wanted it," he said, and the words slipped between them like smoke. She didn't want to hear that voice again, not now. Not ever. Not when it still made her skin tighten, not when Thorn was pacing again, quiet but agitated. Not when her body remembered his hands before her mind could shove the memories down. "I don't care what you wanted," she said, and her voice shook more than she intended. "You lost that right when you let her." "I didn't let her," Kael interrupted. His voice cracked for just a breath. "She tricked us both." There it was. The lie. The one she expected. Neat. Convenient. Perfectly timed. Her fingers curled tighter around Lior's body. He had stirred slightly, soft now, his head against her shoulder, but his scent was stronger than ever. Any wolf could have tracked it, and Kael had. Kael's eyes lingered on Lior. The bond vibrated between them, not quite formed, not acknowledged, but present. It shimmered faintly, like heat off the road. "You have no idea what she did," he said. Quieter now. "But you will." Raisa turned her back to him and walked toward the bedroom. She didn't ask him to leave. She knew he wouldn't. There was no point pretending this could be hidden anymore. Her son had shifted in the open. That meant others had scented him too. Which meant she and Kael weren't the only ones coming. As she lowered Lior to the bed, her breath caught. A low growl, barely audible, rose in her chest, not hers. "Thorn. Mine." The voice wasn't angry. It was awakened. Behind her, Kael had stepped into the hallway. She didn't need to turn to know how close he was. She could feel him like static, like lightning about to strike. His presence filled the space between her shoulder blades. When he reached past her, not to touch her but to brush his fingers gently against the boy's arm, the heat of him skimmed her skin, and she nearly forgot to breathe. Thorn didn't growl again, and Varric, his wolf, rumbled softly in her mind just for a moment. Not a word, just sound, like the beginning of something long buried rising again through soil and ash. Neither of them spoke. The past stood between them like a wall of bone and blood, but even as her fingers curled around the doorframe, ready to slam it shut again, her body betrayed her. Because she could still feel him, and she knew, down to the marrow of her bones, that their story had never really ended. It had only been waiting. Chapter 2. Alpha eyes in the doorway. The morning came without peace. Raisa hadn't slept. Not truly. Not with Kael seated in her living room, his presence stretching across the small house like something half-forgotten, but still deeply embedded in the skin. Even with the bedroom door closed, she felt him like a pressure in the air, like a scent that wouldn't leave her lungs. Not even her dreams were her own. He haunted them too, standing in doorways, watching, waiting, never speaking. When the light broke through the thin curtains, she had already dressed and watched her son sleep for a long, still hour. Lior's breath had steadied, but his body trembled now and then, even in sleep. His wolf wasn't supposed to wake this early, and certainly not like this. Something wasn't right. Not with his shift. Not with the energy he'd released. It didn't move like a child's. It had coiled and expanded, pulsing with something older, heavier, not bred into him but buried deep, as though waiting to be claimed. She stepped out into the hallway, slow and quiet, her bare feet silent against the floor. She hadn't seen Kael since she'd retreated the night before. Hadn't spoken another word. She hoped, maybe foolishly, that he'd taken the hint and left before dawn. But when she reached the living room, he was still there, seated, unmoved, the way she remembered him from long before, back when he kept vigil over their training grounds, quiet as stone and just as unshakable. He didn't turn when she entered, but he'd known. He always knew. His voice came low and even, like the tone hadn't changed overnight. Like there wasn't a chasm between them. You shouldn't have stayed here this long. Raisa didn't answer right away. She moved to the small kitchen table, pulled out the chair opposite him, and sat slowly. The coffee pot was cold. She didn't care. You don't get to say what I should or shouldn't have done, she said, voice level. Kael's eyes lifted to her then. Slow, precise, not accusing, not even angry, just clear. And that clarity, more than rage, unsettled her. There are wolves moving through the neutral zones, he said. You've been lucky to go unnoticed this long. Neutral to who? She asked, knowing the answer. To your pack? To everyone. She caught the edge in his voice then, the way it tightened subtly on the last word, as though he didn't like the idea that others might have found her first, as though it mattered now, when everything had already been undone. You came for him, she said, not me. There was no accusation in it, no bitterness, just truth, laid bare between them like old bones. Kael nodded once. I came because I felt him shift, but you're not separate from that. You never were. Her stomach twisted, but she kept her face composed. His eyes stayed on her longer than she could handle, and she stood without thinking, moving toward the window. The street was quiet. The town hadn't woken yet. Across the road, Mira's curtains were still drawn. The world looked unchanged. Only she wasn't. She felt him move behind her, not close, not touching, but close enough that his scent curled into the air beside her. Cooler than it used to be, but still distinct, still maddening. Pine and iron, and something quieter beneath that. Something like regret. When did you know? He asked, and the question brushed against her ribs. She didn't turn. When I felt him inside me, she said quietly. When Thorn woke to protect what was left. Kael's breath shifted behind her, not loud, just present. I never meant for you to run. She turned then. I didn't run, she said. I survived. Their eyes locked, and something sharpened in his. Not defensiveness, not pride. Something older, weightier. You think I chose her? He said, voice rougher now, quieter. You think I broke the bond? I don't think, she cut in. I saw. I smelled her on you. I heard your voice say her name in my place. Kael stepped forward once, just enough to close the distance between them to something too small to ignore. She could feel the heat radiating from him now, not just his body, but Varric, his wolf, watching her from behind his eyes. I was drugged, he said, blood-rooted spell. I didn't know where I was until the bond was all ready. His jaw tightened. I woke up in her bed, and you were gone. She didn't want to believe him. Not because it sounded untrue, but because it opened too much. If what he said was real, if Selene had used magic to force a fracture in the mating bond, then every day Raisa had spent alone had been a choice built on a lie. She looked down at her hands, fingers curled slightly. They didn't shake. She wished they would. Shaking would mean she was falling apart, but she wasn't. She was just hollow. Kael reached for her then. Not a touch, not yet, just the movement. His hand lifted, hovered near her jaw, and for a long second he didn't close the space. The tension stretched thin, unbearable, the echo of a touch remembered but never completed. She didn't pull away. He brushed his knuckles against her cheek, and the contact was nothing, and yet everything. Not because it was tender, but because it was familiar. Because her body remembered it without permission. I mourned you, he said low. Every day. Her throat thickened and she hated it. I buried you, he added. Because I thought you'd rather die than come back. His hand fell away slowly, and the absence of it burned worse than the memory of his betrayal. I stayed gone because I had no choice, she said, more to herself than him. Because I couldn't protect him from the rest of the world, only from you. Kael's voice dropped. And now you can't protect him from them. That silenced her because he was right. And the weight of it dropped like a stone in her chest. He turned away first, stepping back into the center of the room, looking too large for the space, like everything in the house was too small to hold what he carried. He looked tired, not outwardly, not physically, but the kind of weariness that came from 6 years of silence. "He's not safe here," he said. "Not anymore." Raisa's gaze drifted to the hallway. Lior was still asleep, but she could feel the restlessness from here, the slow return of his waking mind, the hum of something beneath his skin that wasn't supposed to be there yet. The wolves would come for that hum. Power always drew attention, and Kael had followed it first. She folded her arms over her chest, but the gesture didn't help. "And if I say no?" she asked. "If I say we stay hidden like we always have?" Kael turned back to her. "You won't," he said. His voice wasn't arrogant. It was sure. Because he knew her. Because part of her hated how right he was. He walked past her, heading for the front door, and paused with his hand on the knob. The silence stretched. Then he said, softer than before, "Pack law won't protect him, only we will." When he opened the door and stepped out, the cold morning air rushed in. She didn't follow. But she didn't lock the door behind him either. Chapter 3. The pull that never died. The storm began before the sky admitted it. A low murmur rolled across the valley, heavy with the scent of rain and old earth, the kind that seeped through walls and skin alike. Raisa stood at the window, the light from the street lamps bending faintly across the glass, her reflection half there, half lost to shadow. Lior slept again, exhausted from what his small body had endured. His fever had broken, but something restless lingered beneath his skin, a slow thrum that vibrated against her palm when she touched him. Kael hadn't left the property. He was somewhere outside. She could feel it as much as smell it. That faint trace of pine and smoke lingered like a tether. Every few minutes it flared as if the wind carried the shape of his breath, then faded again, slipping through her awareness like the pull of a tide. She hated that she still knew his rhythms, that her heartbeat remembered him. She pressed her hand flat against the cold window pane, trying to ground herself in the small space she'd built, in the fragile human world that had once felt enough. The walls here had known laughter, soft singing, bedtime stories told under covers. It had been safe. But now every corner felt borrowed, every breath counted. The rain started without warning, thin lines at first, then sudden sheets that blurred the view of the street. Through it, she caught a glimpse of movement. A tall figure stood at the edge of the yard, head tilted toward the sky, coat darkened by the downpour. He wasn't guarding. He wasn't watching for threats. He was waiting. For her. She hated herself for opening the door. The air outside clung to her skin, cool and electric. Kael turned his head slightly when she stepped out, the corner of his mouth barely moving. He looked as he always had, composed, certain, every line of his body precise. The rain slicked through his hair, darkening it to near black, but he didn't seem to notice. "You should be inside," he said, though his voice didn't carry the command it used to. It was quiet, almost human. "You're soaked," she murmured. He gave a small, humorless sound, the ghost of a laugh. "I've been through worse." She wanted to hate him for the calm in his voice, but something softer lived beneath it now, a quiet edge that hadn't existed before. He looked up toward the house, then to her again. "We should leave before dawn." She stiffened. "You think I'll just go back? After everything?" "I think," he said, taking a step closer, "you'll do whatever keeps him alive." The way he said him made her throat tighten. Rain dripped from the edge of her hairline, running down her cheek, and she wasn't sure if it was the rain or tears anymore. She stepped back, but he followed, closing the distance by another heartbeat's worth of air. "When did you stop trusting me, Raisa?" She almost laughed, sharp, bitter. "The night before our bond ceremony seems like a reasonable time." He didn't move again, didn't argue, just let the words settle between them like mist. When he spoke, it was quieter, heavier. "You think I don't remember what it felt like when you vanished?" The silence that followed. The bond tearing. You think I didn't feel it too, she said. I thought it was the last thing you left me with. He looked at her for a long moment, and then, slowly, he stepped closer. The air between them changed. It thickened, became something heavy and magnetic. She could feel his warmth even before he reached her, his scent rising above the rain, the thrum of his pulse barely masked by the storm. Then tell me, he said, voice low. Tell me you don't feel it now. Her breath caught before she could stop it. The truth wasn't something that could be denied. The bond, the one she thought dead, pulsed faintly, fragile but undeniable. Her wolf stirred again, pressing against the walls of her chest, whispering something wordless. Dangerous. She should have stepped away. She should have walked back into the house, closed the door, and buried whatever this was for good. But she didn't. He reached out, fingers brushing a strand of wet hair from her face. The touch was light, almost reverent, and yet it burned. Her body betrayed her before her mind could stop it. She leaned into the warmth of his hand, only slightly, but enough to feel the tremor in his fingers. You shouldn't, she whispered. I know. He didn't move away. The rain hissed around them, the storm growing louder, wrapping them in a cocoon of sound. His thumb traced the curve of her cheekbone down to her jaw, then stopped there, hovering at the edge of a memory neither of them had ever escaped. The silence between them was a living thing. And in that silence, something shifted. Not a decision, not forgiveness, just gravity. Slow, relentless, pulling them back into the orbit they had both tried to escape. He leaned in until his breath brushed her temple, his voice rough as stone. When I thought you were gone, I swore I'd never feel this again. She wanted to ask what this was, but her body already knew. It was the ache that lived in her bones when she looked at him. The sharp, unyielding need she'd buried for 6 years. When his hand slipped to the back of her neck, she let out a sound too soft to be heard. It wasn't surrender, not yet. But it wasn't resistance either. The storm broke overhead, louder, fiercer, as if the world itself couldn't bear the tension stretched between them. And then, just as his mouth brushed the edge of her hair, a sound split the moment, the faint whimper of her son from inside the house. Kael's body went still. His hand dropped. The world crashed back into place around them. Raisa turned first, heart hammering for reasons she didn't want to name. She moved quickly, almost running back through the door, every instinct rising. Lior was sitting up, eyes wide, the faint shimmer of silver still glowing at the edges of his irises. Kael followed her inside, his presence filling the space again. The boy blinked sleepily at them, then whispered, I had the dream again. Raisa knelt beside him, smoothing his hair back, whispering words she didn't even remember forming. Her voice calmed him, and soon his small body softened against her. Behind her, Kael stood silent, watching, something fierce and fragile moving in his gaze. He had been her ruin once, he might be again. But for the first time in 6 years, Raisa felt something other than fear at the thought of him. She felt alive. Chapter 4. Return to the Packlands. The road twisted through the forest like an old scar, long healed but never forgotten. Wet pine needles blanketed the shoulder where the trees leaned in close, their branches heavy with rain from the night before, casting long shadows across the gravel. Raisa kept her eyes fixed on the path ahead, but her thoughts pulled constantly to the man seated beside her, silent behind the wheel, his presence more consuming than the steady rhythm of the tires against the road. She hadn't wanted him to drive. She hadn't wanted to be inside the truck at all, with its faint, unmistakable scent of pack territory clinging to every surface. But after Lior's second shift, brief, violent, and uncontrollable, there had been no more delaying. They had packed before dawn. Kael had offered no threats, only a steady voice and quiet hands that gathered what little she would take. Lior hadn't protested. He had clung to her shirt in sleep and murmured in a language no child his age should have known. Now the boy slept again in the back seat, his head turned toward the window, breath fogging the glass. Kael adjusted the rearview mirror to glance at him, and Raisa caught the subtle movement, the softness in his eyes, the way the lines around his mouth shifted not in concern but recognition. The child he hadn't known, but had felt in his bones the moment they stood in the same room. She shifted slightly in her seat as far from him as the cab allowed, though the heat of his body lingered between them, an invisible pull that no space could fully sever. Every time his fingers brushed the gear shift, her breath caught, not because he meant to touch her, but because he didn't. Because he moved with the restraint of a man who knew what it meant to lose her once, and feared it could happen again without warning. The Packlands weren't far now. She recognized the way the road began to narrow, how the pine trees grew thicker, older. The air felt different here, thicker with scent, memory, magic. Her skin prickled beneath her clothes, her wolf stirring just enough to whisper that they were being watched, even if no one revealed themselves. It wasn't until they passed the stone marker carved into the hillside, weather-worn and cracked but still bearing the mark of the Draven line, that Raisa's hands curled tightly in her lap. She had walked these woods as a girl, had trained beneath their canopy, had first kissed Kael here, long before politics and betrayal, long before bloodlines and rituals had become more important than breath and bone. Now she returned not as a daughter of the pack but as something other, something distant and unwelcome. And beside her sat the Alpha, who had once been hers, whose name her body still remembered like a secret carved into flesh. The truck slowed as they approached the gates. 2 guards stepped forward from the trees, both unfamiliar, young, tight-shouldered, wearing the dark gray sigils of Kael's command. They recognized him instantly, eyes lowered, posture perfect. When one of them glanced at her, recognition flickered and then quickly vanished, replaced by the careful blankness of trained deference. No questions were asked. The gate opened without a word. Inside the compound, nothing looked the same. Buildings had been rebuilt, paths reshaped. The training fields stretched wider, reinforced by wooden barricades, and the Alpha's house stood taller now, its stone walls darkened with time and weather. But the air still smelled of ash and pine and old promises. Raisa rolled down the window slightly and breathed it in, even as her chest tightened. Kael parked near the main house and turned off the engine. Neither of them moved. The silence between them thickened until it pressed against her skin like heat, not hostile, but charged. Finally, he spoke, his voice low, not quite touching her but close enough to feel. "You don't have to stay in the Alpha quarters, there's a guest house further back. It's quiet." She turned to him finally. His eyes met hers, steady and unreadable. "I'm not your guest," she said. His jaw shifted slightly. "No, you're not." Before she could say more, the door to the main house opened, and Celine stepped out. She descended the steps slowly, wrapped in pale gray silk that clung to her like mist. Her hair was coiled into an effortless braid over one shoulder, and not a thread of her expression was out of place. She looked every bit the Luna she had stolen, serene, untouchable, cruel in her perfection. But it was her eyes that snapped something loose in Raisa. They didn't widen in surprise, they didn't narrow in suspicion. They gleamed, as if she'd been expecting this return all along. "Kael," Selena called softly, her voice lilting and sweet as poisoned honey. "You didn't tell me we'd have visitors." Raisa stepped out of the truck before Kael could answer. She didn't speak, didn't rise to the bait, just reached into the back seat and lifted Lior into her arms. He stirred faintly, his cheek pressing into her collarbone, still warm from sleep. Celine's gaze shifted toward the boy and paused. The look lasted only a heartbeat, but Raisa saw it. The crack, the brief flicker of calculation. And then, it was gone. Replaced by a smile, too controlled to be real. "Well," Celine said smoothly, walking forward. "A child. How precious." Raisa didn't respond. She didn't trust herself to. Not with the way her hands had started to shake, not from fear, but from the tight fury coiled low in her spine. Her wolf was awake now, fully present, watching from behind her eyes with cold, assessing silence. Kael moved to stand beside them, close enough that his shoulder brushed hers. The contact shouldn't have meant anything, but it did. It grounded her. Claimed something. Celine noticed. Her mouth twitched slightly before she turned back toward the house. "There's food prepared," she said, her voice too light. "Room's ready. I'm sure we'll have much to talk about." She disappeared into the house without waiting for an answer. Kael glanced down at Raisa and something passed between them, an old language without words. They moved together toward the guest house, his hand skimming Lior's back once in quiet acknowledgement, his body always a step behind hers, as if he didn't want to force himself into the space she hadn't yet offered. The guest house was tucked behind a thicket of fir trees, its door creaking softly as Kael opened it for them. The interior was clean, Spartan, but warm. A fire crackled low in the hearth. There were blankets folded neatly, supplies already laid out. Someone had prepared it, likely Arden, someone who remembered how to show care without words. She laid Lior on the bed, brushing his hair back gently as he drifted deeper into sleep. Her chest ached as she watched him. There was no space for him in this world, not truly. He was born of broken bonds and blood magic, and yet his breath was steady, his presence a light she could not lose. When she turned back to Kael, he hadn't moved. He stood just inside the door, watching her as if he hadn't looked away since they left the truck. "Thank you," she said, voice quiet but certain. He nodded once. "I'll post a guard outside." As he moved to leave, she stepped forward. Not far, just enough that he paused in the doorway, and she didn't touch him, but she didn't need to. He felt it, the shift in the air. The bond tugged gently at its frayed edge, whispering something old and unfinished between their pulses. Kael turned just slightly, his voice barely audible. "He's strong." She nodded. Stronger than he should be. A long pause passed between them, thick with something they couldn't name. And then, before he could vanish into the dark, she said the thing neither of them had dared. "Whatever you think we are now, we were never finished." He didn't speak. He only looked at her as if she had reached inside his chest and pulled out whatever part of him had been locked away. And then he left, but not far. He would never be far again. Chapter 5. The bond still burns. Raisa woke to the scent of pine smoke and damp stone, a smell so familiar it sent a ripple through her chest before her eyes had even opened. The room was still dark, though the fire had been stoked in her sleep. Someone had come in quietly, tended to it, and left without disturbing a thing. Lior still slept in the corner cot, curled beneath heavy blankets, a sliver of moonlight across his small, peaceful face. The air inside the guest house held a faint warmth, but outside, the wind had turned. She could feel it shifting under the walls, pressing with the warning of a storm that would not be delayed. Autumn in the mountains came fast and without apology. The pack would be preparing, just as they always had. Hunting, warding the borderlines, drawing closer around their center like ribs around a heart. Her wolf was awake now, no longer the dull echo she had carried alone in the human world. Thorn pressed closer with each passing hour, sharpening her senses, watching through her eyes. Not with words, not yet, but with presence. Unrelenting and quiet. Raisa stood, pulled a shawl across her shoulders, and stepped outside. The wind met her like a breath to the face, carrying with it the sense of the packlands, the scent of soil turned from rain, of distant fir, of pine broken underfoot. She crossed the clearing in silence, boots sinking slightly into the moss-wet earth. Her fingers wrapped around the edges of her shawl, holding it tight across her chest. She didn't need to look to know Kael was there. He stood just beyond the circle of trees, facing the direction of the northern border where the old trails twisted out into no man's land. His coat was unfastened, the long lines of his body still as stone, but she could feel the way his energy moved. Slow, alert, heavy with thought. She hesitated at the edge of the path just long enough for him to sense her. He turned, not quickly, not surprised, as though he'd known she would come. His eyes held a softness she didn't recognize. Not weakness, Kael had never known weakness, but something else, something worn in and quiet. "You never slept," she said. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked past her, toward the light beginning to rise just beyond the ridge. "Your scent's changed," he murmured, "since you came back." Raisa tilted her head slightly, uncertain whether it was meant as a warning or something else. "Your wolf's closer now," he added, "stronger." "She's awake," Raisa said, and there was no pride in it. No fear either. Just truth. He nodded. "She feels it too." Raisa stepped closer, her arms still wrapped tightly across her middle. The wind lifted her hair, and Kael's gaze flicked to the movement before settling back on her face. There was something in his expression she couldn't name. Not longing. Not exactly. It lived deeper than that. Like hunger. Pressed down so long it had become silence. "I don't know who I am here anymore," she said, voice low. "I don't know what I'm supposed to be." "You're Lior's mother," he said simply. "You're the mate I never got to claim." The words should have caught her off guard. They didn't. Not entirely. But they settled differently now. Not as a wound reopened, but as a tether resurfaced. He looked at her long and unflinching until her breath came a little shallower, and her arms dropped from where they held her shawl, letting it loosen around her shoulders. She didn't mean to take another step closer, but she did. "You don't get to say that after 6 years," she whispered. He didn't answer, not with words. Instead, he stepped forward, so close that the breath between them became shared space, and the scent of him, smoke, pine, and something older, folded around her again like it never left. "I would have torn the world down to find you," he said, voice rough. "Then why didn't you?" Her voice broke just slightly. "Because I thought I broke you," he answered. The space between them narrowed until it was no longer space, only tension, stretched to its limit. Her body trembled, not with cold, but with memory. Not with uncertainty, but with the ache of recognition. He reached up slowly, hand grazing the line of her jaw. Not claiming, but asking. Waiting. And when she didn't pull away, his palm settled fully against her cheek. The heat of it slid down her spine like something remembered in the bones. Her breath caught, but she didn't move. Couldn't. "You said it wasn't finished," he murmured. "Do you still believe that?" Raisa's heart beat once, twice, loud in her ears, and then she let her head tilt just slightly into his touch. Not a surrender. A reckoning. "I never stopped feeling it," she said. His other hand rose, fingers brushing the edge of her shawl from her shoulder, exposing the line of her collarbone to the morning chill. Her skin tingled where the air touched it, but even more where his eyes followed. When he leaned in, his mouth hovered near hers, not kissing, not yet, just waiting in that agonizing breath of space where longing lives just before it breaks. Her body swayed toward him. Then the wind shifted again, sharp and wrong, carrying with it the scent of fur not born of their pack. Kael stilled. The moment fractured. He pulled back just enough to glance beyond her, and she felt his wolf rise instantly, awareness sharpening. The tension that had burned with heat only moments ago now turned electric with warning. "Scout," he muttered, voice gone flat. "From where?" she asked, even though she already knew. "Varric's territory," he said, "too close." Raisa's stomach dropped. She stepped back fully now, wrapping the shawl tighter. The cold seemed to bite deeper than it had before. Kael didn't move at first, his jaw tight, his body caught somewhere between the man and the wolf beneath his skin. "I need to speak with Arden," he said. "You should go back to the house." Raisa didn't argue. Her wolf, too, had felt the shift in the air, the intrusion. And beneath that, a new kind of fear, one that wasn't for herself. She turned, walked back across the field, each step heavier than the last. When she reached the threshold of the guest house, she paused and looked back once. Kael still stood at the edge of the trees, his profile carved in the half-light, gaze fixed on the horizon. But she felt it, even from here. The bond still burned, not softly, not patiently, but like a wildfire waiting for the wind to shift. Chapter 6. Ties that cannot be faked. The walls of the guest house no longer felt like shelter. They pressed in around her, too quiet, too still. The tension in the air hadn't broken with the dawn. It had thickened, drawn tighter across her skin, across her senses. The moment outside with Kael still lived behind her ribs, echoing in the places her body refused to forget. And yet now, in the silence that followed, something colder had settled beneath it. Lior had woken shaken, his small body twitching through dreams he couldn't explain. Raisa had found him standing at the window, eyes wide, silver lingering faintly in the dark ring of his irises. He said nothing, just leaned into her side and let her wrap her arms around him like he hadn't done in years. She dressed him carefully as if it mattered what he wore, though she knew it didn't. The pack wouldn't see the child, only what he meant, what he threatened, what he represented. Her hands shook slightly as she buttoned his coat, and Lior caught her wrist gently, glancing up at her with something far too knowing in his expression. "Is it because of the people outside, or?" he asked. She hesitated. "What people?" "The ones who smell like metal," he whispered. "Like burnt leaves." She froze. That wasn't Kael's pack. It wasn't anyone who belonged here. Later, she found Kael in the central clearing speaking with Arden. The older wolf stood with arms folded, his body always a little too tense for comfort, his sharp eyes cutting through the fog like knives. He gave her a brief glance when she approached, something unreadable passing through his gaze, but he didn't speak. He didn't need to. Kael turned toward her before she opened her mouth. "There have been tracks in the northern ridge," he said, voice low. "Old enough to hide, but not ours." "Varex," she said, not asking. Kael gave a slight nod. She didn't ask what they were going to do about it. The answer would be war, eventually. It always was. The conversation ended without words. Raisa turned away and walked the perimeter of the territory alone for a while, trying to keep herself grounded, but her thoughts betrayed her. She couldn't stop seeing the way Kael had looked at her in the trees, the way his fingers had traced the line of her jaw, slow and reverent, like the memory of her had haunted his hands. It was easier somehow to be angry with him, easier to hold on to the betrayal than to face the pull that had never truly gone dormant. It still lived in her marrow, in the heat beneath her skin, in the way her breath hitched when she caught his scent. Even now, it wasn't just memory. It wasn't habit. It was need. Later that day, Kael asked her to bring Lior to the main house for a formal introduction. She refused, then agreed, then hated herself for agreeing. The sun was low when she walked Lior up the familiar stone steps, his hand small and warm in hers. He clung close, watching everything, saying nothing. He was more wolf than boy today, quiet, observant, aware of things that weren't visible to the eye. He sniffed the air as they reached the threshold, and she felt the moment his body tensed. The door opened before she could knock. Celine, always perfectly timed, she smiled. Too wide, too composed. Her eyes swept over Raisa with a familiarity that felt like a blade drawn slowly down the spine, then dropped to the boy. "This must be him," she said. "The little spark everyone's so curious about." Lior didn't move. He didn't even blink. Celine crouched slowly like a predator pretending to be harmless, and tilted her head at him. "You've got your father's eyes," she said too softly, "but your mother's—" Silence. Raisa didn't speak. She didn't reach for him. She let him stand on his own, even when her chest tightened. Then without warning, Lior bared his teeth, not a smile, not fear, a warning. A low growl rumbled from his chest, not childish, not staged. It rippled through the wooden floor like something ancestral. Raisa's heart surged with pride and dread. Selena's eyes flicked upward in surprise, and for the first time, something cracked in her expression. Kael appeared in the hallway then, drawn by the sound. He didn't speak as he approached, only looked at the boy with a slow, assessing stillness. Lior stepped back from Celine without being told and moved closer to his father. Kael reached out, tentative, resting a hand gently on Lior's shoulder. The boy didn't flinch. His small frame leaned into it, as though he knew. Raisa watched them from the doorway, the image of them etched into her like frost against glass. She'd prepared herself for this, feared it even, but nothing could have readied her for the way Lior instinctively tilted his face toward the man he hadn't known. How Kael's hand curved protectively over his son like it had always belonged there. Selene turned away without another word. Her retreat said more than anything else could have. Raisa caught Kael's gaze briefly before she stepped forward. "You didn't teach him that," she said. Kael shook his head. "It's in him." She didn't know if he meant the growl, the fire, or the blood. Lior was taken into the main hall by one of the caretakers, invited to meet a few of the pups his age under watch. Raisa stayed behind. Kael stayed with her. They stood in the empty corridor as the doors closed, silence folding around them. "I don't want her near him again," Raisa said. "I'll see to it," Kael replied. She didn't thank him. He didn't expect her to. Instead, she leaned against the wall, letting the cool stone press into her back. Kael stepped closer, one slow movement at a time, until there was no space between them, but air and tension, and years unspoken. His eyes searched hers, not demanding, but open. The weight of everything they hadn't said lived between them, a pressure just under the surface, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. He raised his hand again, slower this time, and when she didn't move away, he rested it against her waist. Not possessive, not gentle, just real. Her breath came shorter. "I never stopped wanting you," he said, voice rough. The words weren't poetic, they weren't meant to soothe, they were too true for that. Raisa let her head fall forward slightly, her forehead resting against his chest. He stood still, not pressing, not pulling, only steady. She let herself breathe him in, her fingers brushing lightly against the front of his coat, just enough to feel the heat beneath it. When she finally lifted her head, his mouth was close enough to taste the air between them. She felt his breath catch, and then just before it could break, before the kiss they both stood trembling on the edge of, he turned his head. "Not yet," he said. She closed her eyes, not in frustration, but in understanding. Because this bond, this fire between them, it was real. And it deserved not to be rushed. But gods, it burned. Chapter 7. Blood Oaths and Broken Truths. The forest held its breath. Every sound had fallen into a hush too complete to be natural. The birds no longer called from the treetops. Even the wind had gone still, hanging in the canopy like a held note. It was the kind of silence that lived just before something changed. The kind of quiet that made the wolves inside their skins stir, restless and suspicious. Raisa stood just outside the ceremonial ring, her arms at her sides, her body unmoving as the cool morning pressed into her. She had dressed plainly, as tradition demanded. Bare feet, bare arms, no weapons, no sigils, no protection. The stone path beneath her soles was slick with dew, but she didn't feel the cold. Her blood ran hotter than it should, her pulse steady, but too strong. Lior remained behind with Mira, hidden in the elder den, deep within the trees and well away from what was about to unfold. Raisa had kissed his forehead that morning without speaking, the weight of too many memories crowding her voice. He had asked no questions. His eyes had only lingered on hers, wide and quiet, and something in him had seemed to understand that this day wasn't one he could be part of. Not yet. The circle ahead was carved into the earth itself, surrounded by low, jagged stones bleached pale by time. The elders had gathered along the edges, silent as statues. Arden stood just to Kael's right, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Across the circle, Selene waited, a drape of pale blue silk wrapped around her body, hair braided into an intricate crown that gleamed like gold in the gray light. She didn't smile. Not today, because this was no longer a game. This was a reckoning. Kael stepped forward first. The Alpha's word had summoned the right. It would be his voice that called the truth forward. Raisa watched him move, the lines of his body tense but controlled, every step deliberate. He wasn't the boy she'd loved, the warrior she'd trained beside. He was something more than that now. And still, somehow, the same. His presence shifted the air when he entered the ring, his power rolling off him in a steady, silent wave. When he spoke, it was not loud, but the ground seemed to take notice. 6 years ago, the mating bond between myself and Raisa Vale was broken on the eve of its sealing. She vanished. I did not search. A stir moved through the outer circle. A few of the elders blinked, slow and deliberate, like creatures waking from stone. I did not search, Kael repeated, because I believed the bond severed by betrayal. He turned toward Celine, his voice neither gentle nor cruel. I believed she had chosen my brother's mate claim over mine, that she had taken from me what I had given freely. The air shifted again. I was wrong. Raisa didn't flinch. She let the words move through her, a current she didn't trust but couldn't stop. Kael turned toward her then, and for the first time, the circle held more than ceremony. It held breath. I have seen the child, he said. He is mine. Another shift, this time sharper. Several of the outer ring drew back slightly. He carries my blood, Kael said, and hers. Celine stepped forward then, her voice a blade made of velvet. This proves nothing. Wolves have been born of many. She tilted her head. Bloodlines do not prove bonds. Lies make better stories than truth. Kael did not look at her. He didn't need to. It is not the blood, he said. It is the bond. And the magic she used to sever it. Raisa's heart stopped for a breath because there it was. The hidden blade. The secret they had only spoken of in shadow. Celine's body didn't move, but her wolf surged forward, just slightly, just enough to push the silence wider. The edge of her glamour rippled. Her voice lost its poise. You would accuse me now? She asked, and something in her tone cracked. After 6 years of silence? I accuse nothing, Kael said calmly. I offer proof. He held out a small copper vial no larger than a child's thumb. Inside, a single drop of dark red swirled in slow circles. Elder blood. Blood that could bind or break. Raisa's throat tightened, because she remembered the night she found it, buried at the bottom of a ruined satchel, tucked in a cloth stained with dried herbs. Lior had picked it up first, not knowing what it was, but Raisa had known. Kael opened the vial and let the single drop fall into the earth. The ground accepted it with a hiss that rose into the air like smoke. The trees shuddered, the stones pulsed, and the bond answered, not with words, with force. Raisa felt it before her mind could catch it, her body lifting slightly, the edge of her senses peeling open. A cord, once severed, yanked taut again, linking her to Kael with a heat so intense it felt like drowning. She gasped, staggering forward. Kael caught her without hesitation, his arms closed around her as if they had never belonged anywhere else. The bond lit the space between them in a pulse that only wolves could feel. And Celine stumbled back, not far, but enough. Her wolf shrieked, not aloud, but in a mental howl that fractured the silence. No, she said, voice sharp and rising. You can't prove this. I don't have to, Kael said, because the bond had already done it. And the elders felt it. Their verdict didn't need words. One by one, they turned away from Celine, their silence heavier than judgment. Celine looked around the circle and found no ally. Not Arden, not even the silent, aging crones who once admired her composure. Her fury showed in the tremor of her hands. Her wolf clawed beneath her skin, desperate, trapped, betrayed not by the others, but by the bond she could never own. She spat at the earth, her voice trembling with rage. You'll regret this. But her threat was small, because the truth had already spoken. Kael stepped back, but his arm remained around Raisa's waist. She hadn't pushed him away. She hadn't moved at all. She leaned into his side, her body still vibrating with the echo of what had just passed through her, not magic, not words. Something older. Celine turned, and this time no one followed her. The exile had not yet been spoken, but it was already beginning. As her footsteps vanished into the woods, the last tendrils of her false grace fell behind her like shed skin. Raisa felt the bond still burning through her chest, not weakly, not uncertainly, fully. She looked up at Kael, and this time he didn't turn away. His mouth hovered just above hers, not in hesitation, in reverence, and then he kissed her, not to claim, but to remember, to promise, to begin again. Chapter 8. Moonlit ruin, firelit choice. The sky bled red where the sun had fallen, casting long shadows through the forest, turning every pine needle and branch into something ancient and watchful. The packlands had always shifted with dusk, their scent changing, their quiet deepening, the very ground whispering the weight of what had come before. But tonight, the air was different, tense, strained. Even the wind moved like it was holding back. Raisa stood at the edge of the old ceremonial ground, the one that had not been used since before her exile. Vines had crept over the outer stones, lichen dulled the carvings, and moss spread thick beneath her boots, soft and unwelcoming. This place had once been sacred. Now it felt like a memory, one left to rot. Behind her, Kael approached without sound, and still, she felt him long before she turned. The bond hummed again, stronger now, like a current warming the blood in her veins. The kiss from earlier still lived in her mouth, not soft, not sweet, but deep and solid, acclaiming in silence. It hadn't undone her. It had stitched something shut. He stopped beside her but didn't speak. Neither of them had, not since Celine had vanished into the woods under a silence that would soon become exile. The pack had not spoken her name since. Her scent had already begun to disappear, and with it her presence. But something else stirred now, something that didn't come from within. The first growl came from the south, low, feral, not one of theirs. Kael's shoulders stiffened. His eyes narrowed, already scanning the tree line. Raisa stepped forward, body braced, senses flaring outward in every direction. The bond between them sparked like a lit wire. They didn't need words to communicate now. It was breath and instinct, movement and stillness. Then came the second sound, closer, not a growl, a scream. She knew that voice, one of the scouts, young, foolish, and too far from the inner circle. Kael moved first, Raisa followed without thought. The trees blurred past as their wolves surged forward, not in full shift, but just enough to make the world split at the edges. Their muscles moved like predators, their breathing deeper, their bones already preparing for what might come. Raisa had never felt her body move so easily, as though her wolf had finally stopped watching from behind her eyes and now walked with her. They broke through the line of trees near the southern ridge, where the old border stones stood like broken teeth. A body lay sprawled just beyond them, limbs twisted, eyes open. There was no time to mourn. Movement snapped behind the body. 3 wolves, black-furred, sleek, unfamiliar. Not scouts, not Kael's. They wore no sigils. Their eyes were too pale, too hungry. Varex, and they'd come early. Kael didn't hesitate. His voice shifted into command, something old and guttural, and his body exploded into fur mid-motion. Varex surged forward, massive and dark, teeth gleaming like bone. Raisa followed without pause, her own body folding forward, her breath caught in the crackle of bones and fire. Thorn took her place in the world with a roar that lived in the earth more than the air. She was leaner, faster. Silver streaked through her fur like lightning. Together they collided with the invaders. Blood didn't spray. This wasn't carnage, this was precision. A dance of instincts sharpened by rage. Kael took 2. She took 1. Thorn was fast, low, tearing the flank before the wolf had time to counter. She didn't kill. Not yet. Not unless she had to. One retreated, the others didn't rise again. It was over in moments, but the silence that followed was worse. Because now they knew. This had not been a warning. This had been a test. Raisa shifted back slowly, her body aching but alive. Kael followed a moment later, his chest heaving, blood streaked down one arm, but already drying in the cold. He looked at her across the clearing, and the fury in his eyes faded just enough to make space for something else. He crossed to her in 3 strides. His hands didn't tremble when he touched her. They were still strong, steady, warm. She leaned into him without a word, pressing her forehead to his chest, the scent of pine and blood, and him wrapping around her like protection. Her fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt. His arms closed around her like he'd never let go. Neither of them spoke. They didn't have to, because the fear didn't live between them anymore, only fire. Kael's mouth found hers again, not rushed this time, not desperate, deep, slow, certain, like he was memorizing her, not reclaiming. She felt it down to the marrow, the burn, the belonging. His body pressed against hers in quiet insistence, not need but closeness. The heat between them wasn't wild anymore. It had shape, intention. He pulled back just far enough to rest his forehead against hers. The wind moved again, and it carried the scent of something else. Familiar. Too familiar. She stiffened. Kael did too, Lior. The scent was wrong. Faint, but rising. Too close. Kael moved first. Raisa followed, her heart already hammering. They ran through the trees, past the border stones, over the ruined path that once led to the northern den. The scent thickened. Something sharp in it. Magic. Not Lior's, not Kael's. Something darker. Wild. The clearing broke open, and there, at the center of it, stood a boy, eyes glowing with silver so bright it hurt to look at. Lior. His mouth moved soundlessly, and around him the air shimmered like heat over fire. Kael stopped short. Raisa didn't. She reached him first, fell to her knees, arms catching him just as his legs gave out. His breath was still in him, but barely. The energy around him pulsed once, twice, then faded into the ground. Whatever had touched him was gone, but it had left its mark. Kael knelt beside her, one hand on Lior's shoulder, the other steady on her back. He didn't speak. Neither did she. Lior's breath evened slowly, and his head dropped against her chest, a sound like a sigh leaving his lips. She looked up at Kael. There was no fear in his face, only understanding, and whatever power Varric was hunting, Lior had already begun to carry it. But here in Kael's arms, in the ruin of old stone and blood and fire, Raisa knew only one truth. They would protect him, together, and no one, no past, no exile, no rival alpha, would take that from them again. Chapter 9. Exile by Moonlight. The moon was high, thick and full, spilling its silver weight across the packlands with a kind of finality that left no corner untouched. The trees stood still, shadows gathered tightly beneath their boughs, and the earth beneath Raisa's bare feet felt heavy with something ancient, as though the soil itself understood what was about to be done. She stood again in the circle, but this time she was not the one on trial. Celine knelt in the center of the stone ring, her hair no longer coiled in gold and perfection, but loose and clinging to her skin, damp with sweat, her shoulders squared in the way of someone who knew the sentence long before it was spoken. The glamour she had so carefully woven was gone. She looked smaller now, thinner, less wolf than woman. The elders stood silent in the shadows, their eyes unreadable, their faces painted with old ash and wisdom. Their judgment had been delivered the night before, unanimous. Kael had not spoken then. He hadn't needed to. The bond had already revealed its truth. The magic she'd used had left traces no elder could deny. Blood magic to fracture a mating bond, a child hidden to protect what was rightfully his, and in the middle of it all Celine with her lies woven into every corner of the pack's history, like rot in a root system, choking the truth just enough to make it easy to ignore. Now there would be no more ignoring. Kael stood at Raisa's side, his body radiating heat, his presence grounded and unyielding. His hand brushed hers once, not a request, not a plea, but a shared breath. She didn't pull away. Her fingers twined with his for the first time since before it all shattered, and that one quiet connection held more weight than any sentence spoken aloud. He stepped forward then. Alone. The role of alpha demanded it. Celine lifted her head to meet his gaze, but her eyes were hollow now, the poison in them diluted, spent. Whatever fight she had left was already unraveling. "You were my blood," he said, his voice low but steady. "But that did not give you the right to rewrite what was never yours." The words were not meant to wound. They were not laced with hatred. They were a burial, a closing of something that had long festered. "You fractured the bond," he said. "You broke the order of our kind. You took my mate. You tried to shape a world that would accept your lie as truth." Celine swallowed once. Her voice did not rise to meet his. She said nothing. Kael turned his gaze to the circle. "Let her wolf be stripped of rank," he said. "Let her blood be erased from the register of the Packlands. Let her name be silenced in every link of the bond. She is no longer sister, Luna, or kin." The wind stirred, the bond responded. Raisa felt it, like a thread snapping somewhere deep in her chest, not hers, not Kael's, but something peripheral. Something that had once pulled at the edges of every wolf in the pack. Now it was gone. Celine gasped. Not dramatically, not loudly, just enough to show she'd felt it. Then she shifted, not by choice, and her body dropped forward, bones cracking, skin folding, fur bursting through as though something inside her had been pushed out, stripped of its name, its shape. Her wolf was pale gold, thinner than Raisa remembered, lean and exhausted. The shift should have been fluid. It wasn't. It shook. She staggered as she stood, then turned, and no one stopped her. That was the law. To be exiled was to be forgotten. And so Celine fled, her paws kicking up old dust, her tail low. Her wolf didn't howl. It didn't dare. Raisa stood there, the sound of silence roaring around her, Kael still at her side. The weight in her chest didn't lift. It shifted. A part of her had been bound to Celine, no matter how deep the betrayal. That part now felt like an ache pressed into scar tissue. Kael's hand found hers again, and he didn't speak. He didn't need to. When the circle cleared and the pack began to return to their homes, Kael didn't lead them. He stayed behind, watching the trees where Celine had vanished. Raisa stepped in front of him, her fingers still linked in his. His eyes were distant, but not lost. Focused, heavy, tempered by years of wounds layered on wounds. He looked at her like she was the only thing keeping him steady. She moved closer, closing the last of the space between them, her body folding against his as if it had never forgotten how to do it. His arms wrapped around her slowly, tightly, like a man who no longer feared he was holding a ghost. She tilted her face up. He met her halfway. The kiss was quieter than the one before, but deeper. Not about fire this time. About home. About returning. About something neither of them had dared believe could ever be found again. Her lips parted beneath his, soft and certain. His hand slid up her back, holding her like she was the axis he revolved around. There was nothing rushed in the way their bodies touched now. Only reverence. Only ache. Only years undone. When they pulled apart, neither of them said what they both knew. That this time there was no going back. Later, under the weight of moonlight and silence, Raisa lay curled against him in the guest house, her head resting against the curve of his shoulder, her body wrapped in warmth and the steady rhythm of his breath. The fire crackled low, and Lior's soft breathing rose and fell from the other room, safe, untouched by what had come before. Kael's fingers traced idle paths down her spine. Her wolf purred softly under her skin the way she hadn't in years. And for the first time since the night it had all shattered, Raisa let herself exhale completely. She was not alone, not anymore. Chapter 10. The mating that was meant. The wind carried the scent of renewal. Not spring. This wasn't the tender softness of new buds or the warmth of long sun. This was sharper, older, the scent of pine stripped bare after rain, of stone warmed by fire, of something that had been torn apart and finally pieced back together. Raisa stood in the old mating grounds as the last threads of dusk unraveled across the sky. The stone arch behind her had crumbled in places, roots growing through the cracks, but the circle still held its power. Some spaces didn't need to be perfect to be sacred. They only needed to remember. And this ground remembered her. She had come full circle, but not as the girl who had once approached this place with trembling hands and a heart wide open. That girl had died on the night her bond had been broken. What stood here now was a woman rebuilt, sharpened, loved again not through promises but through time, through truth, through battle and choice. The shawl draped across her shoulders had been hers once before exile. It smelled faintly of cedar and smoke. She hadn't worn it in years. Tonight it felt right. A piece of who she had been, laid gently over the skin of who she'd become. Behind her, footsteps crunched soft against moss and stone. She didn't turn. She didn't need to. Kael moved into the circle like he belonged to it. Not as alpha, not as leader, as a man, as hers. His scent reached her first, pine and warmth and the faint, subtle wildness of a storm held just behind the ribs. He said nothing as he came to stand before her, and when his fingers lifted to brush back a lock of hair from her temple, she leaned into the touch as though no time had ever passed between them. The bond shimmered between them now, not as a wound, not as something bruised and aching, but as a thread of heat and gravity and quiet power. It had healed, it had grown, and tonight it would be sealed the way it had always been meant to be. Kael lifted her hand in his, lowering his head to press his mouth against her knuckles. His lips lingered, not in performance, but in reverence. When he looked at her, she saw no hesitation, no echo of the night that had broken them, only the man who had waited, whether he'd known it or not. They moved together to the center of the circle, where a small basin of moon-fed water had been left by the elders. There were no witnesses beyond the wolves in the woods, no crowd, no spoken rites. Their bond had already spoken. Their son, asleep not far from the clearing, had already completed the circle they hadn't known was still forming. Raisa reached into the basin first, cupping the water and pressing it to Kael's brow. It dripped down slowly, carving a line across the bridge of his nose, his cheekbones, his jaw. His eyes didn't leave hers. Then he mirrored her. His fingers trailed the water across her face with a gentleness that undid something quiet inside her chest. When he leaned in, it wasn't rushed. Their mouths met slowly with the weight of years and longing and forgiveness. His hands came to rest on her hips, pulling her closer, their bodies aligning with a kind of certainty that only belonged to wolves who had already chosen each other long before this moment. Raisa's breath hitched softly against his lips, not from hesitation, but from the sharp ache of knowing that this was what she'd been walking toward all along. Through betrayal, through exile, through motherhood, through every night she'd spent curled alone with her back to the wall, this had waited. Kael rested his forehead against hers and his voice came quiet, like a vow spoken to the air and the earth alike. "We begin now." She nodded. "We already did." They shed the remnants of their old selves in silence. Clothes slipped away, not in haste but with purpose, baring skin not just for the sake of touch but for truth. Scars were revealed. His, deep and rough across the ribs. Hers, subtle, silver lines etched from shifts and flight and fear. But none of them mattered now. They weren't marks of weakness. They were proof of survival. When they sank together to the moss-soft ground, the bond surged. It wasn't a flare, it wasn't fire. It was weightless and vast, a joining that felt as though it reached backward through everything that had tried to divide them and folded it into something whole. Their bodies moved slowly, carefully, like two halves remembering how to be one. Kael kissed her throat, her shoulder, the line of her collarbone, each movement etched with heat and unspoken devotion. Raisa arched beneath him, every nerve alive with memory and newness intertwined. There was no past here, no ruined night, no fractured bond. Only now, only breath and sweat and the rhythm of heartbeats sinking. And when it ended, when the bond locked into place, sealed not by magic but by choice, their wolves howled in unison. Thorn rose in her chest, wild and whole, her song folding into varix, like an old echo finally answered. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Later, beneath the canopy of stars, Raisa lay wrapped in Kael's arms, her head resting against his chest, his heartbeat steady beneath her ear. The warmth of his skin, the weight of his hand at her waist, the quiet strength in his breath, it all felt like home, not the kind that could be built with stone or walls, but the kind made in bodies, in vows, in returning. They had been broken, but only so they could be remade. From the other side of the clearing, sound of footsteps rustled through the brush, light and familiar. Lior stepped into the circle, his eyes still heavy with sleep, but glowing faintly with that silver sheen. He didn't speak, just padded across the grass and climbed between them, curling against her chest, Kael's arm immediately wrapping around them both. The three of them together under moonlight, no longer hidden, no longer hunted, a family at last. The bond pulsed once more, bright, whole, unshaken, and then the forest exhaled.